The dust swirled like angry spirits across the parched main street of Red Bluff, California. As Margaret Griffith pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of the general store, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her brother-in-law's words still rang in her ears, cold and possessive. "You belong to me now, Margaret. The law says everything that was his is mine, and that includes you." It was the summer of 1874, 3 months since her husband Thomas had been laid in the ground after the influenza took him. 3 months of gradual terror as Vernon Griffith's intentions became clear. The morning sun beat down mercilessly. Much like Vernon's presence in her life had become inescapable and suffocating. Margaret clutched the paper list in her hand, the edges damp from her nervous perspiration. She had only ventured into town for supplies, hoping to avoid Vernon, who had taken to watching her every move from the porch of what had once been her and Thomas's home. A home that, according to the law and Vernon's interpretation of it, now belonged to him along with their small ranch, their livestock, and apparently Margaret herself. At 26, Margaret had never imagined herself in such a position. She had married Thomas with love and hope, leaving behind her family in Missouri to build a life in California. Now, she found herself alone, vulnerable, and increasingly frightened of the man who was supposed to be her protector by relation. "Mrs. Griffith." A voice startled her from her thoughts. "Are you all right?" Margaret turned to find Mrs. Abernathy, the milliner's wife, looking at her with concern. "Yes, thank you. Just catching my breath in the shade," Margaret replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You look pale as a ghost, child. Come inside and have some water." Margaret nodded gratefully and followed Mrs. Abernathy into the cool dimness of the millinery shop. The older woman poured water from a ceramic pitcher into a tin cup and pressed it into Margaret's hands. "It's that brother-in-law of yours, isn't it?" Mrs. Abernathy asked, her voice low. "People talk, you know, and what they're saying about Vernon Griffith isn't flattering." Margaret sipped the water, her throat tight. "He says I'm his now, that everything Thomas owned belongs to him by law." Mrs. Abernathy's face darkened. "That's not right at all. A woman isn't property to be passed around like livestock." "I don't know what to do," Margaret confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "He's taken the house, the land. He's even wearing Thomas's clothes. Last night he tried to enter my bedroom." Mrs. Abernathy placed a comforting hand on Margaret's arm. "You need help, dear, and soon." The bell above the shop door jingled and both women turned. A tall man ducked his head as he entered, removing his hat in a gesture of courtesy. The sunlight from the doorway silhouetted him momentarily before Margaret could make out his features. "Pardon, ladies," he said, his voice deep and gentle. "I'm looking for Mr. Abernathy. I've got those leather goods he ordered." "He's in the back, Mr. Tucker," Mrs. Abernathy replied. "I'll fetch him for you." As Mrs. Abernathy disappeared behind a curtained doorway, Margaret found herself studying the man before her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin that spoke of long days outdoors. His hair was the color of dark honey, curling slightly at the edges of his collar, and his eyes were a clear, steady blue that reminded her of the summer sky over the plains. "You're staring, madam," he said with a slight smile that creased the corners of his eyes. Margaret flushed. "I apologize." "I was lost in thought." "No need for apologies. I'm Garrett Tucker," he said, extending a hand. "New to these parts, relatively speaking. Been working the Stephenson Ranch about 10 miles east." Margaret hesitated before placing her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, but his grip was gentle. "Margaret Griffith." Recognition flickered in his eyes. "Thomas Griffith's widow." She withdrew her hand quickly. "Yes." Garrett Tucker's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Griffith. I knew Thomas slightly. Good man." Before Margaret could respond, the shop door burst open again, and Vernon Griffith strode in, his tall frame dominating the small space. His face, so similar to Thomas's, yet somehow harder, crueler, darkened when he saw Margaret. "There you are," he said, ignoring Garrett completely. "I've been looking all over town for you." Margaret felt herself shrinking, folding inward as she always did in Vernon's presence. "I'm just gathering supplies, Vernon. You should have told me you were coming to town. It's not proper for a woman to be wandering about alone." Vernon's gaze shifted to Garrett, taking in the stranger's presence with obvious displeasure. "Who's this?" "Garrett Tucker," Garrett replied before Margaret could speak. "I work for the Stephensons, and you are Vernon Griffith. I'm responsible for Mrs. Griffith here." His emphasis on the word responsible made Margaret's skin crawl. "Come along, Margaret. We're going home." Vernon reached for Margaret's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh as he pulled her toward the door. She winced, her water cup clattering to the floor. "She doesn't appear to be done with her business," Garrett observed, his voice still calm but with an edge that hadn't been there before. Vernon turned, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't your concern, Tucker. Margaret is my brother's widow, and as such, she's under my protection. Legally, everything that was his is now mine to manage." Garrett's jaw tightened. "She's not property at all, Mr. Griffith. She's a person with her own will." The tension in the small shop thickened. Margaret could see Vernon's hand twitching near his hip where he kept a small revolver. But before the situation could escalate, Mr. Abernathy emerged from the back room, oblivious to the confrontation. "Mr. Tucker, I've been expecting you. Do you have those saddle bags I ordered?" The interruption seemed to diffuse some of the tension. Vernon used the moment to tug Margaret toward the door. "We're leaving now," he hissed in her ear. Margaret threw a desperate glance over her shoulder at Garrett, who was watching them with a frown. His eyes met hers, and something passed between them, an understanding, a promise. Then Vernon pulled her outside into the blinding sunlight. "What were you doing talking to that man?" Vernon demanded as he marched her down the boardwalk toward where his wagon was hitched. "I wasn't. He came in while I was speaking with Mrs. Abernathy." Vernon's grip tightened. "Don't lie to me, Margaret. I saw the way you looked at him." "Vernon, please," Margaret pleaded, trying to pull away. "You're hurting me." People on the street were beginning to stare. Vernon noticed and immediately loosened his grip, though he kept his hand firmly on her arm. "Get in the wagon," he ordered, his voice low. "We'll discuss this at home." The word home twisted in Margaret's stomach. It wasn't home anymore, not with Vernon there. As she climbed into the wagon, she felt a chill despite the summer heat. Vernon had been growing bolder, more possessive, and she feared what discussing this at home might entail. As Vernon walked around to the driver's side, Margaret noticed Garrett Tucker standing in front of the millinery, watching them. Their eyes met again, and this time Margaret allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in months: hope. The ride back to the ranch was silent, the tension between them palpable. Vernon kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the reins. Margaret stared at the passing landscape, the golden hills dotted with oak trees, trying to formulate a plan. When they arrived at the ranch, Vernon helped her down from the wagon with a grip that was both possessive and threatening. "Go inside and start dinner," he commanded. Margaret nodded silently and headed toward the house she had lovingly built with Thomas, now defiled by Vernon's presence. As she stepped onto the porch, she heard Vernon call after her. "And Margaret, don't think about that cowboy. You're mine now. The sooner you accept that, the easier things will be." Margaret didn't respond. She entered the house, closing the door behind her, and leaned against it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She couldn't stay. Not another night. not with Vernon's intentions becoming clearer by the day. She moved through the house, gathering essentials, a change of clothes, a small framed photograph of Thomas, the little money she had hidden in a jar of dried beans. She would wait until nightfall when Vernon had drunk himself into a stupor as he did most evenings. Then she would take one of the horses and ride. Where? She didn't know, but anywhere was better than here. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Margaret prepared dinner mechanically. Vernon sat at the table, watching her every move, a bottle of whiskey at his elbow. "You know why I'm doing this, don't you?" Vernon said suddenly, his words slightly slurred. "A woman needs protection. Thomas knew that. He'd want me to look after you." Margaret set a plate of stew in front of him, careful to keep her distance. "Thomas would want me to be happy," Vernon snorted. "Happy? What does that matter? You need a roof over your head, food in your belly. I'm providing that." He took a long swig of whiskey. "I'm being generous, Margaret. Most women in your position would be grateful." Margaret said nothing, pushing her own stew around her plate without eating. "You'll warm up to me eventually," Vernon continued, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Thomas got the pretty one, always did get the best of everything. But now it's my turn." As the evening wore on, Vernon drank more, his speech becoming increasingly slurred, his eyes heavy-lidded. Finally, he stumbled to the sofa in the sitting room and collapsed, snoring within minutes. Margaret waited, her heart hammering, until she was certain he was deeply asleep. Then she gathered her small bundle of possessions and crept out the back door. The night air was cool on her face as she made her way to the small stable. Inside, she quickly saddled Penny, the gentlest of their 3 horses, whispering soothing words as she worked. "We're going away, girl," she murmured. "Far away from here." Leading Penny quietly from the stable, Margaret mounted and urged the mare away from the ranch at a walk, careful not to make noise that might wake Vernon. Only when they were a safe distance away did she nudge Penny into a trot, then a canter, heading south toward Red Bluff. She had no clear plan beyond getting away, but as she rode through the moonlit landscape, Margaret felt a freedom she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Whatever lay ahead couldn't be worse than what she was leaving behind. The moon was high in the sky when Margaret reached the outskirts of Red Bluff. The town was mostly dark, with only a few lamps burning in windows. She slowed Penny to a walk, uncertain where to go. The hotel would be too expensive, and besides, Vernon would likely look for her there first. As she passed the livery stable, a figure stepped out of the shadows, causing Penny to shy nervously. Margaret tightened her grip on the reins, ready to flee. "Mrs. Griffith." A familiar voice called softly. Margaret squinted into the darkness. "Mr. Tucker." Garrett Tucker stepped forward, his face illuminated by the moonlight. "I thought that might be you. Are you all right?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded. I had to leave. Vernon, he—" "Say no more," Garrett interrupted. "I understand." He glanced around the deserted street. "You need somewhere safe to stay. Follow me." Without waiting for her response, he turned and began walking, leading his own horse. After a moment's hesitation, Margaret followed, guiding Penny alongside Garrett's mount. "I've been staying with the blacksmith's family," Garrett explained as they walked. "James Holden and his wife, Clara. They're good people. Clara will take you in without asking too many questions." "Why are you helping me?" Margaret asked, studying his profile in the moonlight. Garrett was silent for a moment. "I recognize a person in trouble when I see one, and I've heard things about Vernon Griffith that didn't sit well with me." They arrived at a modest house on the edge of town. A small lamp still burned in one window. Garrett tied his horse to a post and helped Margaret down from Penny. "Wait here," he said, then approached the door and knocked softly. A minute later, the door opened, and a woman with gray-streaked hair peered out. She and Garrett spoke quietly for a moment, then she looked past him to where Margaret stood with the horses. Her expression softened, and she beckoned. "Come in, child," she called softly. "You're safe here." Tears of relief pricked Margaret's eyes as she tied Penny beside Garrett's horse and approached the house. Clara Holden placed a gentle arm around her shoulders and led her inside. "James is already asleep," Clara explained, leading Margaret to a small but clean bedroom. "But he'll understand. We have a spare room that's yours for as long as you need it." "Thank you," Margaret whispered, overwhelmed by the woman's kindness. "Mr. Tucker tells me you've had some trouble," Clara said, her voice gentle but direct. "You don't have to explain tonight. Get some rest. Things will look clearer in the morning." After Clara left, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing her tears to fall. She heard murmured voices from the front of the house, Clara and Garrett discussing something. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock at her door. "Mrs. Griffith." "It's Garrett Tucker." Margaret wiped her tears and opened the door slightly. Garrett stood in the hallway, his expression concerned. "I'll be leaving now," he said. "But I wanted to assure you that you'll be safe here. The Holdens are good people." "Thank you," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." "No need for repayment, but there is something you should know." Garrett's expression grew serious. "Vernon Griffith is wrong about the law. He doesn't own you, and he may not even legally own your property. I have a friend in Sacramento who's a lawyer. I could write to him, ask for his advice." Hope fluttered in Margaret's chest. "You would do that," Garrett nodded. "I'll come back tomorrow if that's all right. We can talk more then." Margaret nodded, suddenly exhausted. "Thank you, Mr. Tucker." "Garrett, please." "Garrett," she repeated, the name feeling strange and yet somehow right on her lips. "I'm Margaret." He smiled, a gentle, reassuring expression that reached his eyes. "Get some rest, Margaret. Tomorrow is a new day." As she closed the door and prepared for bed in the small, unfamiliar room, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of possibility. Vernon would come looking for her, she had no doubt. But for tonight at least, she was safe. And tomorrow, perhaps, she would find a way forward. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains, waking Margaret from a deeper sleep than she'd had in months. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar room confusing her. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back: Vernon's threatening behavior, her escape in the night, Garrett Tucker's unexpected assistance. She rose and dressed quickly in the same clothes she'd worn the day before, smoothing her hair as best she could without a brush. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Clara Holden in the kitchen, kneading dough on a flour-dusted table. "Good morning, dear," Clara said with a warm smile. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in a long time," Margaret admitted. "Mrs. Holden, I can't thank you enough for taking me in last night." "Clara, please. And there's no need for thanks. Any decent person would have done the same." She gestured to a chair at the table. "Sit. I've got coffee brewing and biscuits in the oven." Margaret sat, feeling awkward but grateful. "I don't want to be a burden. I can work to pay for my keep." Clara wiped her hands on her apron and poured coffee into a mug for Margaret. "We'll discuss that later. For now, let's get some food in you. You're thin as a rail." As Margaret sipped the strong, hot coffee, the back door opened and a burly man with a thick beard entered. He nodded at Margaret without surprise. "You must be Mrs. Griffith," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "James Holden, welcome to our home." "Thank you, Mr. Holden," Margaret replied. "I'm sorry for the intrusion." "No intrusion," James said, pouring himself coffee. "Any friend of Garrett's is welcome here." He exchanged a meaningful glance with his wife. "Especially one in need of sanctuary from the likes of Vernon Griffith." Margaret stiffened. "You know Vernon?" Know of him, James corrected. He's got a reputation in these parts and not a good one. His brother was well respected, but Vernon, he shook his head. Let's just say I'm not surprised you felt the need to leave. Clara placed a plate of hot biscuits on the table. Eat, both of you. The day's getting on and James has work at the forge. As they ate, James explained that he was the town blacksmith and that Garrett had been helping him with some larger jobs for the past few weeks. Fine worker, that one, James commented. Strong as an ox but gentle when needed. Good with horses, too. Margaret listened, curious about the man who had come to her aid. How do you know him? Met him when he first came to town about a month ago, James explained. He was looking for work and I needed an extra pair of hands. He's been staying in our spare room, the one you're in now. Margaret put down her biscuit, dismayed. I've displaced him from his bed. Oh, I didn't realize. Nonsense, Clara interrupted. He insisted, said he'd sleep in the stable loft at the livery where he's been keeping his horse. It's no hardship for a cowboy like him. After breakfast, James left for the forge and Clara showed Margaret around the small house and garden. I could use help with the vegetable patch, Clara said, if you're willing. Of course, Margaret replied eagerly. I'm used to garden work. They spent the morning weeding and watering, the physical labor a welcome distraction from Margaret's worries. Clara was a comfortable companion, chatting about town gossip and her 3 grown children who had all moved away to start families of their own. That's why we have the spare room, she explained. We keep it ready for when the grandchildren visit, but that's not for another month. Around midday, they heard a horse approaching. Margaret tensed, fearing it might be Vernon, but Clara peered over the garden fence and smiled. It's just Garrett, she said. Bringing lunch by the look of it. Garrett dismounted, carrying a small basket. Ladies, he greeted them. I brought food from the hotel restaurant. Thought you might appreciate not having to cook, Clara. You're a thoughtful man, Garrett Tucker, Clara said, taking the basket. Come inside, both of you. I'll make fresh lemonade. Inside, as they ate the simple but hearty meal of fried chicken and cornbread, Garrett updated Margaret on what he'd learned. I sent a telegram to my lawyer friend in Sacramento first thing this morning, he said. Asked for his opinion on your situation. Should hear back in a day or two. Margaret nodded gratefully. Thank you, but I'm afraid Vernon will come looking for me before then. He already has, Garrett said grimly. He was at the sheriff's office when I passed by this morning, demanding they find you and return you to his custody, his words. Margaret's stomach clenched with fear. What did the sheriff say? Sheriff Miller's a fair man. He told Vernon that you're a grown woman, free to come and go as you please. Said unless Vernon had proof you'd committed a crime or were mentally unsound, there was nothing he could do. And Vernon's response, Garrett's expression darkened. He wasn't happy. Said some things about a woman's place and a man's rights. Then he stormed out, saying he'd find you himself. He will, Margaret said, her appetite gone. He knows everyone in town. Someone will tell him where I am. Not likely, Clara interjected. Vernon Griffith isn't well liked in Red Bluff. Most folks were fond of your husband and have been concerned about you since his passing. Garrett leaned forward, his blue eyes intent on Margaret's face. Tell me about your situation, Margaret. The property, your marriage to Thomas, anything that might help my lawyer friend advise us. Margaret took a deep breath and began her story. She explained how she and Thomas had married 6 years ago in Missouri, then traveled west to California to start a new life. They'd purchased a small ranch outside Red Bluff with money Thomas had saved working as a cattle driver. Thomas worked hard to make the ranch profitable, Margaret explained. We were just starting to do well when he fell ill. The influenza took him in less than a week. Her voice faltered, and Clara reached across the table to squeeze her hand encouragingly. Vernon arrived about a month after the funeral, Margaret continued. Said he'd only just received word of Thomas's death. He offered to help with the ranch, and at first I was grateful. But then, she described how Vernon had gradually taken control of everything: the finances, the livestock decisions, even insisting on moving into the main house while Margaret was still deep in mourning. He kept saying it wasn't proper for a woman to live alone, that people would talk. Then he started referring to the ranch as his property, saying that as Thomas's only living male relative, everything legally belonged to him now. Did Thomas leave a will? Garrett asked. Margaret shook her head. He always meant to, but he was young, only 32 when he died. We didn't think. She trailed off, regret evident in her voice. And your marriage papers, proof of property purchase, in a tin box in my bedroom. Vernon doesn't know about it, at least I don't think he does. Garrett nodded thoughtfully. That could be important. Do you want to go back for it? The thought of returning to the ranch made Margaret's heart race with fear. I don't know if I can face Vernon again. You wouldn't have to, Garrett assured her. I could go, tonight after dark. That's too dangerous, Margaret protested. Vernon has a gun, and he's quick to anger, especially when he's been drinking. I can handle myself, Garrett said simply, and I won't be alone. James will come with me. Clara nodded in agreement. James may look like a bear, but he moves quiet as a cat when he needs to. They'll be careful. Margaret looked between them, overwhelmed by their willingness to help her, a virtual stranger. Why are you doing this? She asked softly. You barely know me. Garrett's expression was earnest. Because it's the right thing to do. Because no one should be treated as property, especially not by someone like Vernon Griffith. He hesitated, then added, and because from the moment I saw you in that millinery shop, I knew you were someone worth helping. His words warmed something inside Margaret that had been cold for months. She lowered her eyes, suddenly shy under his direct gaze. Clara broke the moment by standing and beginning to clear the dishes. Well, that's settled then. James and Garrett will go tonight. In the meantime, Margaret, you'll stay hidden here. I don't think Vernon would dare come looking for you at our house, but better safe than sorry. The rest of the day passed slowly. Margaret helped Clara with household chores, grateful for the distraction. When James returned from the forge in the late afternoon, Garrett was with him, and the two men spent time in quiet conversation, planning the night's expedition to the ranch. After supper, as dusk began to fall, Garrett and James prepared to leave. They dressed in dark clothing, and James tucked a pistol into his belt. Just in case, he explained to Margaret. Don't worry, I'm not looking for trouble. Before they left, Garrett took Margaret aside. Is there anything else at the ranch you need, besides the document box? Margaret thought for a moment. My mother's locket, it's in a small jewelry box on my dresser. And there's a book of poetry Thomas gave me for our anniversary. It's under my pillow. Garrett nodded, memorizing the items. We'll find them. Now, can you draw a map of the ranch? Show us the layout, where your bedroom is, where Vernon might be sleeping. Margaret quickly sketched a rough map, indicating the location of her bedroom at the back of the house, and explaining that Vernon had taken to sleeping in what had been Thomas's study, near the front. He usually drinks in the evening, she added. By this time, he's likely asleep on the sofa in the sitting room, but be careful, he's a light sleeper when he's been drinking. We will, Garrett promised. He hesitated, then placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Try not to worry. We'll be back before you know it. After they left, Margaret and Clara sat in the kitchen, sipping tea and making small talk that did little to mask their shared anxiety. The hours stretched interminably until, just after midnight, they heard the soft sound of horses approaching. Clara peered out the window. It's them, she said with relief. Moments later, James and Garrett entered through the back door, their faces flushed with success. Garrett carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "We got everything," he said, handing the bundle to Margaret. "No trouble at all." Vernon was passed out cold, just as you predicted. Margaret unwrapped the bundle with trembling fingers. Inside was the tin document box, the small jewelry case containing her mother's locket, and the book of poetry from Thomas. She clutched them to her chest, tears of gratitude welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Both of you." James nodded acknowledgement, then yawned widely. "Time for bed. It's been a long day." After James and Clara retired, Margaret and Garrett remained at the kitchen table. Margaret opened the document box, showing Garrett the marriage certificate and property deed. "These are good," Garrett said, examining the papers. "Clear proof that Thomas purchased the property after you were married. In California, that should mean the ranch is yours by right." "But without a will," Margaret began. "Let's wait to hear what my friend says," Garrett advised. "For now, at least we have the documents safe." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, then Garrett spoke again, his voice soft. "May I ask you something, Margaret?" She nodded. "What will you do? If we can establish your legal right to the property, will you stay and run the ranch yourself?" Margaret considered the question. "I don't know. I loved the ranch because it was the home Thomas and I built together. But now, there are too many memories, too much pain." "You could sell it," Garrett suggested. "Start fresh somewhere else, perhaps." Margaret looked at him curiously. "What about you, Garrett? What brings a man like you to Red Bluff?" Garrett's eyes grew distant. "I've been drifting since the war. I fought for the Union, came back to find my parents had died of typhoid. The family farm in Pennsylvania was sold for taxes." He shrugged. "I headed west, worked cattle drives, ranch hands, whatever would put food in my belly. No family, none living. My parents are still in Missouri. I have a sister in Oregon I haven't seen in years." Margaret traced the edge of the document box with her finger. "I felt very alone since Thomas died." "I understand loneliness," Garrett said quietly. "It's why I keep moving. Easier than putting down roots only to lose them again." Their eyes met across the table, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. Then Garrett stood, breaking the spell. "It's late. You should rest. Tomorrow might bring answers from Sacramento." Margaret nodded, gathering her precious items. "Good night, Garrett, and thank you again." "Sleep well, Margaret." As she settled into bed that night, Margaret found herself thinking not of Vernon or the ranch or even Thomas, but of Garrett Tucker, his steady blue eyes, his gentle strength, and the way he had risked himself to help her without hesitation. For the first time in months, she fell asleep with something other than fear in her heart. The next morning brought unwelcome news. Margaret was helping Clara prepare breakfast when they heard raised voices from the street. James, who had gone out to open the forge, rushed back into the house. "Vernon Griffith is in town," he reported grimly. "And he's drunk, armed, and asking about Margaret at every business on Main Street." Margaret's hand flew to her throat. "Did he see you?" "No, I came back through the alley, but it won't be long before someone mentions that you might be with us." Clara moved quickly, gathering food into a basket. "You need to leave, Margaret, now before he comes here." "But where would I go?" Margaret asked, panic rising in her voice. "The Stephenson Ranch," James said decisively. "It's where Garrett has been working. Stephenson is a good man, an old friend. He'll hide you until this blows over." "I'll go saddle your horse," Clara said, already moving toward the door. "Wait," Margaret protested. "I can't just leave. What about you? Vernon could be dangerous if he's drunk and armed." "We'll be fine," James assured her. "Vernon may be a bully, but he's not fool enough to threaten a blacksmith in his own forge. Now hurry, gather your things." Margaret rushed to pack her few possessions, her hands shaking. By the time she returned to the kitchen, Clara had returned from saddling Penny. Garrett left at dawn to work at the Stephenson Ranch, James explained, sketching a rough map for Margaret. Follow the creek east out of town for about 10 miles. You can't miss the ranch, it's the biggest in the area. Ask for Stephen or Martha Stephenson, tell them who you are. They'll keep you safe until Garrett returns. Margaret hugged both Clara and James. I don't know how to thank you. You can thank us by staying safe, Clara said, pressing the food basket into Margaret's hands. Now go, quickly, through the back garden. There's a path that leads to the creek without going through town. With a final grateful look, Margaret slipped out the back door and hurried to where Penny was saddled and waiting. She mounted quickly and urged the horse along the narrow path Clara had indicated, her heart pounding in her ears. The path wound through scrubby brush and stands of oak trees before meeting up with a clear, swift-running creek. Margaret turned Penny east as instructed, following the waterway. The morning was already warm, the California sun beating down on her back as she rode. She had been traveling for perhaps an hour when she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats behind her. Glancing back, she saw a plume of dust rising from the path she had taken. Someone was following her and riding hard. Fear clutched at Margaret's throat. It had to be Vernon. Somehow he had discovered where she was heading. She urged Penny into a gallop, the food basket bouncing precariously in front of her saddle. The creek path was relatively open, providing little cover for hiding. Her only hope was to reach the Stephenson Ranch before Vernon caught up to her. The hoofbeats grew louder behind her. Margaret risked another glance back and saw a rider gaining on her, a large man on a powerful bay horse. Vernon. Penny was tiring, unused to such a sustained gallop. Margaret could feel the horse's sides heaving beneath her legs. She couldn't outrun Vernon forever. Ahead, the path forked. One branch continued along the creek, the other cut up into the hills. Making a split-second decision, Margaret pulled Penny onto the hill path, hoping the more difficult terrain might slow her pursuer. The path grew steeper, winding between boulders and through stands of pine and manzanita. Penny labored up the incline, foam flecking her neck. Behind her, Margaret could still hear pursuit, though the sounds grew intermittently fainter as the winding path created distance between them. At the crest of a ridge, Margaret paused to let Penny catch her breath. Looking back, she could see Vernon's horse struggling up the path, still a good distance behind. Ahead, the path descended into a valley, and in the distance, she could make out buildings and fenced pastures. The Stephenson Ranch. Relief flooded through her. She was almost safe. She urged Penny forward again, down the ridge toward the valley below. As they descended, the horse's footing became surer, her pace quickening. They were halfway down when disaster struck. A rattlesnake, disturbed by their passage, coiled and struck at Penny's legs. The mare screamed in terror, rearing back. Margaret, unprepared for the sudden movement, lost her grip on the reins and tumbled backward off the horse. She hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. Pain lanced through her ankle as she rolled downhill several feet before coming to a stop against a boulder. Dazed, she looked up to see Penny galloping away down the path, the food basket still attached to the saddle. Margaret tried to stand but cried out as weight on her injured ankle sent sharp pain shooting up her leg. It wasn't broken, she could move it, but a sprain at least. She looked back up the path. Vernon would be cresting the ridge any minute. Gritting her teeth against the pain, Margaret pulled herself to her feet, using the boulder for support. She couldn't outrun Vernon now, but perhaps she could hide. She limped off the path, seeking cover in a dense thicket of manzanita. She had barely concealed herself when Vernon's horse appeared at the top of the ridge. She held her breath as he paused, scanning the valley below. Would he see Penny running riderless and realize what had happened? Vernon nudged his horse forward, continuing down the path. As he passed near her hiding place, Margaret could see his face clearly flushed with alcohol and rage. His eyes narrowed as he searched for her. "Margaret," he shouted, his voice echoing off the hillside. "I know you're out here. Show yourself now, and I won't be too hard on you." Margaret pressed herself deeper into the thicket, ignoring the scratches from the tough branches. Vernon continued down the path, calling her name, his voice growing more threatening with each shout. When he was finally out of sight, Margaret allowed herself to breathe again. But her relief was short-lived. She was stranded on a hillside with an injured ankle, miles from help. Vernon was between her and the Stephenson ranch, and he would likely realize soon that she was no longer on horseback. She had to move. Slowly, painfully, Margaret began to make her way through the brush, parallel to the path but hidden from view. Each step on her injured ankle was agony, but fear drove her forward. She had covered perhaps half a mile when she heard hoofbeats again, this time coming up the path from the direction of the ranch. Vernon returning. She froze, pressing herself against a tree trunk, but the rider who came into view wasn't Vernon. It was Garrett, riding hard, his expression grim and focused. Margaret's heart leaped with relief and joy. "Garrett," she called, limping out from her hiding place. "Garrett here." He reined his horse sharply at the sound of her voice, scanning the hillside until he spotted her. His face transformed with relief. "Margaret." He dismounted quickly and rushed to her side, supporting her as she limped toward him. "What happened? Are you hurt?" Briefly, Margaret explained about Vernon's pursuit, the snake, and her fall. "Penny ran off toward the ranch. Is she all right?" "She arrived about 20 minutes ago," Garrett confirmed. "When I saw your horse without you, I feared the worst. Stephen is organizing a search party, but I rode ahead." His hands gently examined her ankle. "This is swollen badly. Can you ride?" "I think so, but Vernon is down there somewhere," Margaret warned, gesturing toward the valley. "He was looking for me." "I saw him," Garrett said grimly. "He's at the ranch now, demanding they turn you over to him. Stephen is keeping him occupied while I searched for you." He helped Margaret onto his horse, then mounted behind her, his arms encircling her to hold the reins. The solid warmth of his chest against her back made Margaret feel safer than she had in months. "Hold tight," Garrett murmured in her ear. "We're not going back to the ranch just yet. I know a place where you'll be safe while we sort this out." He guided the horse off the main path, taking a game trail that wound deeper into the hills. They rode in silence, Garrett's body shielding Margaret from the low-hanging branches. Despite the circumstances, despite the pain in her ankle and the fear of Vernon's pursuit, Margaret found herself acutely aware of Garrett's proximity, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the subtle strength in the arms that encircled her, the faint scent of leather and clean sweat that clung to him. After about an hour of careful navigation through the rugged terrain, they emerged into a small, hidden valley. A cabin nestled against the hillside, weathered but well-maintained, with a small corral and lean-to stable beside it. "My place," Garrett explained as he helped Margaret dismount. "It's not much, but it's private. Stephen lets me use it in exchange for helping with the more difficult horses on his ranch." He lifted Margaret easily in his arms and carried her to the cabin door, setting her down gently so he could open it. Inside was simple but clean, a main room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn table and chairs, a bed in one corner, and a small kitchen area. "Sit," Garrett directed, guiding Margaret to a chair. "Let me look at that ankle properly." He knelt before her, gently removing her boot and examining the swollen joint. His touch was careful, professional, but Margaret couldn't help the flutter in her stomach as his calloused fingers moved across her skin. "A bad sprain," he diagnosed. "You need to stay off it for a few days." He rose and moved to a cabinet, retrieving bandages and a jar of salve. "This will help with the swelling." As he worked, wrapping her ankle with practiced ease, Margaret asked, "How did you find me so quickly?" "When Penny arrived riderless at the ranch, I knew something was wrong. Clara had already sent word that Vernon was looking for you in town, so I suspected he might have followed you. I was riding out to meet you when I saw Vernon on the path." Garrett's jaw tightened. He was ranting, waving his gun around. "Stefan will keep him contained at the ranch until the sheriff can be fetched." "Vernon won't give up easily," Margaret said quietly. "No," Garrett agreed, finishing with her ankle, "but he's not the only one who can be stubborn." He met her eyes directly. "I received a telegram from my lawyer friend this morning. He says that without a will, California law is somewhat ambiguous about your situation. But he believes that with the marriage certificate and property deed, we can make a strong case that the ranch belongs to you, not Vernon." Hope stirred in Margaret's heart. "Really?" Garrett nodded. "He's taking the next train from Sacramento. He'll be in Red Bluff by tomorrow afternoon." Relief washed over Margaret, quickly followed by exhaustion as the adrenaline of the morning's events began to fade. Garrett noticed her drooping eyelids. "You should rest," he said, helping her to the bed. "I'll ride back to the Stephenson ranch, let them know you're safe, and bring back some food and supplies." "Will you be all right alone for a few hours?" Margaret nodded, suddenly too tired to speak. As Garrett tucked a blanket around her, his hand lingered for a moment on her shoulder. "You're the bravest woman I've ever met, Margaret Griffith," he said softly. "Rest now. You're safe here." As she drifted into sleep, Margaret was certain she felt the gentle brush of his lips against her forehead. But perhaps that was just a dream when Margaret awoke. The cabin was bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. For a moment she was disoriented, then the events of the day rushed back to her. She sat up, wincing at the pain in her ankle. "Easy," Garrett's voice came from across the room. "That ankle needs rest." He was at the fireplace, stirring something in a pot that smelled deliciously of beef and vegetables. He smiled at her, and Margaret felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "How long was I asleep?" she asked, pushing her hair back from her face. "A few hours." "You needed it." Garrett ladled stew into a bowl and brought it to her, along with a chunk of bread. "Eat. Martha Stephenson sent food and Clara packed a bag with some of your things." Margaret ate gratefully, suddenly aware of her hunger. As she finished the stew, Garrett filled her in on what had happened while she slept. "Vernon is in the town jail," he reported. "He got belligerent at the Stephenson ranch, fired his gun into the air. Sheriff Miller arrested him for public drunkenness and discharging a firearm. He'll be held at least until tomorrow." "That gives us time," Margaret said, relief evident in her voice. "What happens next?" "My friend Douglas Warner will arrive on the afternoon train tomorrow. He's bringing legal documents to establish your ownership of the ranch. We'll meet him in town, make everything official, and then—" Garrett hesitated. "Then it's up to you what you want to do with the property." Margaret considered this as she finished her meal. The question that had been forming in her mind all day finally found its way to her lips. "Why are you doing all this for me, Garrett? The truth." Garrett was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "I told you before because it's the right thing to do." "There's more than that," Margaret pressed gently. "No one goes to these lengths for a stranger simply because it's right." Garrett set aside his empty bowl and moved to sit on the edge of the bed. "When I first saw you in that millinery shop, something about you called to me. The sadness in your eyes, yes, but also the strength I sensed beneath it. Then, when Vernon came in, the way he spoke about you as if you were a possession." His jaw tightened at the memory. "I've seen too much of that kind of thinking. During the war, after it. People treating other people as property. I couldn't stand by and watch it happen again. He looked down at his hands, then back at Margaret. "But you're right, there's more. I admire you, Margaret, your courage, your resilience. In the short time I've known you, I've come to." He paused, seeming to search for the right words, "to care for you more than I probably should." Margaret's heart quickened. "I don't think it's possible to care too much," she said softly. "Not in this world." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, understanding, recognition, possibility. Garrett reached out slowly and took her hand in his. "I don't want to presume," he said, his voice low. "You've been through so much. Your husband not long gone, Vernon's persecution. You need time to heal, to decide your own path forward." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Thomas would have wanted me to be happy," she said, echoing what she had told Vernon. "But this time the words felt true, right? He was a good man. He would have liked you." Garrett's smile was gentle. "I wish I could have known him better." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, hands still joined. Then Garrett reluctantly stood. "You should rest that ankle. I'll sleep by the fire." "Garrett," Margaret called as he moved away. "Thank you for everything," he nodded, his eyes warm. "Sleep well, Margaret." The night passed peacefully, and by morning, Margaret's ankle felt somewhat better. Garrett fashioned a walking stick for her from a sturdy branch, allowing her to move around the cabin with less pain. After breakfast, they set out for Red Bluff, riding double on Garrett's horse as they had the day before. The journey was slower this time, Garrett careful to avoid jarring Margaret's injured ankle. They talked easily as they rode, sharing stories of their lives before they met. Garrett told her about growing up on a farm in Pennsylvania, his service during the war, and his wandering afterward. Margaret spoke of her childhood in Missouri, her courtship with Thomas, and their dreams for the future. "We wanted children," she confided. "It never happened for us, but we still hoped." "There's still time," Garrett said, "for dreams, for a family if that's what you want." The simple statement, offered without pressure or expectation, touched Margaret deeply. By the time they reached Red Bluff, a fragile but definite bond had formed between them. They went directly to the sheriff's office, where they found Sheriff Miller behind his desk and Douglas Warner, Garrett's lawyer friend, waiting for them. Warner was a small, precise man with spectacles and a neat beard, but his handshake was firm and his eyes kind as he greeted Margaret. "Mrs. Griffith, a pleasure. Garrett has told me of your situation. I believe I can help." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Vernon Griffith is still in a cell sleeping off yesterday's drunk, but I can't hold him much longer without charges." "We understand, Sheriff," Warner said. "This won't take long." They spread Margaret's documents on the sheriff's table: the marriage certificate, the property deed, tax receipts in Thomas's name. Warner examined them carefully, then nodded with satisfaction. "These are in order." According to California law, property acquired during marriage is considered community property. Without a will stating otherwise and with no children, the surviving spouse inherits everything. "Vernon claims that as Thomas's brother he has rights," Margaret said. Warner shook his head. "Not in this case. He might have had a claim if you and Thomas had never married, or if the property had been purchased before your marriage. But these documents clearly show that Thomas bought the ranch 2 years after your wedding." He produced official-looking papers from his briefcase. "I've prepared a formal declaration of your ownership rights. Once filed with the county, it will be indisputable." Relief washed over Margaret. "So the ranch is really mine?" "Without question," Warner confirmed. "Vernon Griffith has no legal claim to it whatsoever." The sheriff nodded with satisfaction. "That's good to hear. Vernon's been a thorn in this town's side for years. Thomas was the only one who could ever handle him." "What about his threats toward Mrs. Griffith?" Garrett asked. "Can anything be done about those?" "If he directly threatens her again, yes," the sheriff said. For now, the best I can do is have a serious talk with him before I release him, make it clear that the law is on Mrs. Griffith's side. Warner gathered the documents. I'll take these to the county office immediately. By this afternoon, everything will be officially recorded. Garrett placed a supportive hand on Margaret's shoulder. What do you want to do now? Margaret considered her options. The ranch was hers. She could return, run it herself, or with hired help. She could sell it and start fresh somewhere else. Or, she looked at Garrett, at the steady strength in his blue eyes, the gentle curve of his mouth. In just a few days, he had become more important to her than she would have thought possible. I'd like to go back to the ranch, she decided. At least to gather my personal things. After that, I'm not sure yet. I'll come with you, Garrett said immediately. Just in case Vernon shows up. The sheriff nodded approval. I'll keep Vernon here as long as legally possible, give you time to sort things out. After Warner left for the county office, Margaret and Garrett visited the general store to purchase supplies. News of Margaret's legal victory over Vernon had already spread through town, and the shopkeeper greeted her with newfound respect. Always knew that Vernon was no good, he commented as he wrapped their purchases. Your husband was worth 10 of him. Good to see justice done. By mid-afternoon, they were riding toward the ranch, Margaret on Penny, whom the Stephensons had returned to the Holden stable, and Garrett on his own mount. The day was warm but pleasant, a light breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and sage. As they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions. Grief for Thomas, anger at Vernon's presumption, relief that her home was legally hers again, and uncertainty about the future. "Are you all right?" Garrett asked, noticing her expression. "Yes," Margaret said after a moment. "Just remembering." The ranch looked much as she had left it, the small white house, the barn and corral, the vegetable garden now overgrown with weeds. Thomas had named it Griffith Glen after the small stream that ran along the eastern boundary. They dismounted in the yard, and Margaret took a deep breath before approaching the house. Inside, evidence of Vernon's occupation was everywhere: unwashed dishes in the kitchen, discarded clothing on the sitting room floor, empty whiskey bottles on the table. "He didn't take very good care of the place," Garrett observed mildly. "No," Margaret agreed, "but it can be cleaned." She moved through the house, gathering personal items she wanted to keep: photographs, letters, a few pieces of jewelry, books. In the bedroom she had shared with Thomas, she found her wedding ring, which she had removed during the difficult days after his death. She slipped it into her pocket, not ready to wear it again but unwilling to leave it behind. In Thomas's study, now bearing the mark of Vernon's slovenly habitation, Margaret found Thomas's account books. She leafed through them, noting with relief that despite Vernon's claims, the ranch was in good financial shape. Thomas had been a careful manager, and their hard work had been paying off. "Margaret," Garrett called from outside, "come look at this." She joined him in the corral, where he was examining one of the horses, a handsome chestnut gelding that Thomas had been particularly proud of. "This horse has been neglected," Garrett said, running a hand along the animal's ribs. "In fact, all of them look underfed. Vernon hasn't been caring for them properly." Margaret's face hardened. "That doesn't surprise me. Vernon never did understand that ranching is hard work, not just ownership." They spent the next hour tending to the horses and checking the condition of the other livestock. Most were in acceptable condition, but it was clear Vernon had been doing the minimum necessary to keep them alive. "What are you going to do?" Garrett asked as they sat on the porch, watching the sun begin to set over the western hills. "About the ranch, I mean." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not sure I can run it alone, but I don't want to sell it either. Thomas put his heart into this place." You don't have to decide right away, Garrett said gently. The ranch is legally yours. You have time to consider all your options. Margaret looked at him, this man who had come into her life so suddenly and changed it so completely. What about you, Garrett? What are your plans? Garrett met her gaze steadily. I was thinking of staying in the area. I like it here. The work at the Stephenson Ranch suits me, and he hesitated. There are other reasons I might want to put down roots. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Margaret found herself leaning toward him slightly, drawn by something she couldn't name but recognized nonetheless. The moment was broken by the sound of an approaching horse. They both tensed, Garrett moving protectively in front of Margaret as they peered into the gathering dusk. Sheriff Miller rode into the yard, his expression grim. "Thought I might find you two here," he called, dismounting. "I've got news. Vernon broke out of jail about an hour ago, overpowered my deputy when he brought in dinner. Took the deputy's gun, too." Margaret's hand flew to her throat. "Do you think he's coming here?" "I'd bet on it," the sheriff said grimly. "He was ranting about teaching you a lesson before he took off." Garrett's face hardened. "We need to leave now." "Too late for that," the sheriff said, gesturing down the road. "Look." In the distance, a rider was approaching at a gallop, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Even at this distance, Margaret recognized Vernon's powerful frame on his bay horse. "Get inside," Garrett ordered, his voice calm but authoritative. "Sheriff, take Margaret to the back of the house." "I'll deal with Vernon." "Garrett, no," Margaret protested. "He's armed and dangerous." "So am I," Garrett replied grimly, drawing a revolver from beneath his coat. "And I have something to protect." The look he gave Margaret was filled with such intensity that she found herself speechless. The sheriff took her arm, guiding her toward the house. "Come on, Mrs. Griffith. Tucker knows what he's doing." From the back window of the house, Margaret watched anxiously as Vernon rode into the yard, reining his horse to a stop a few yards from where Garrett stood, calm and steady on the porch. "Where is she?" Vernon shouted, his words slurred with anger and probably alcohol. "Where's Margaret?" "She's safe," Garrett replied evenly. "And she's not coming with you, Vernon. The ranch is legally hers. You have no claim to it or to her." Vernon dismounted unsteadily, the deputy's gun in his hand. "She's mine. Everything here is mine. Thomas would have wanted her to be happy and safe," Garrett interrupted. "Not terrorized by his drunken brother." Vernon's face contorted with rage. "What would you know about it? You're nothing but a drifter, a nobody." "Maybe," Garrett acknowledged. "But I know the difference between a person and property." "Margaret isn't yours, Vernon. She isn't anyone's but her own." Vernon raised the gun, pointing it at Garrett's chest. "Get off my land." "Now, or I swear I'll kill you where you stand." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The sheriff moved toward the door, his own gun drawn, but Margaret caught his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Garrett knows what he's doing." Outside, Garrett hadn't moved, hadn't even raised his own weapon. "This isn't your land, Vernon," he said calmly. "It's Margaret's, and I'm not going anywhere." "Then you'll die here," Vernon snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. What happened next was so fast Margaret almost missed it. As Vernon fired, Garrett dove to the side, rolling and coming up with his gun leveled. His shot was precise, striking Vernon's shoulder. The larger man howled in pain, dropping his weapon. The sheriff burst from the house, gun drawn. "Don't move, Griffith," he shouted. "It's over." Vernon clutched his bleeding shoulder, his face a mask of pain and fury. "She was supposed to be mine," he groaned. "Everything was supposed to be mine." "She was never yours to claim," Garrett said, rising to his feet. "People aren't property, Vernon, not ever." The sheriff handcuffed Vernon, ignoring his complaints about his injury. "It's just a flesh wound," he determined after a brief examination. "You'll live to stand trial." Attempted murder, jailbreak, assault on a deputy, you're looking at years in prison, Griffith. As the sheriff led Vernon away to his horse, Margaret rushed out of the house to Garrett. "Are you all right?" she asked, her hands moving over him anxiously, checking for injuries. "I'm fine," he assured her, capturing her hands in his. He wasn't as good a shot as he thought he was, especially not after whatever he's been drinking. Relief made Margaret's knees weak, and she sagged against Garrett, who wrapped his arms around her securely. "I was so afraid," she whispered against his chest, "when he raised that gun." "SHH," Garrett soothed, his hand stroking her back. "It's over now, you're safe. The ranch is yours. Vernon won't be bothering you again for a very long time." Margaret pulled back slightly to look up at him, her hands resting on his chest. "You risked your life for me." Garrett's eyes were soft as they met hers. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat." The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Margaret rose on tiptoe, her heart pounding, and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, a question more than a statement. But when Garrett's arms tightened around her, drawing her closer, it deepened into something more, an answer, a promise, a beginning. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the first day I saw you," he admitted. Margaret smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in months. "I think I have too, though I didn't realize it until now." They might have stood there longer, lost in the discovery of each other, but the sheriff cleared his throat as he returned from securing Vernon on his horse. "I hate to interrupt," he said, not looking particularly sorry at all, "but I need to get Griffith back to town and have the doctor look at that shoulder." Garrett kept one arm around Margaret's waist as they faced the sheriff. "We'll ride in with you," he said. "I think Mrs. Griffith might want to stay at the hotel tonight, given the circumstances." "A wise precaution," the sheriff agreed. "Though I don't think Vernon will be causing any more trouble. I'm putting him in the strongest cell and posting a guard." As they prepared to leave, Margaret took a last look at the ranch house, the home she had shared with Thomas, the place she had both loved and, recently, feared. Now, with Vernon gone and her legal rights established, she felt a sense of possibility rather than dread when she thought of the future. "Penny for your thoughts?" Garrett asked as he helped her mount. Margaret smiled down at him. "I was just thinking that endings are often beginnings in disguise." Garrett's answering smile warmed her to her core. "I believe you're right, Margaret Griffith. I believe you're right." In the months that followed, Margaret's life transformed in ways she could never have anticipated. Vernon Griffith was sentenced to 5 years in the state prison for his crimes, effectively removing his threat from her life. The ranch, legally and indisputably hers, flourished under her direction with considerable help from Garrett Tucker, who proved to be as skilled at ranching as he was at rescuing damsels in distress. Their courtship was proper but swift, both recognizing that what had grown between them in those intense days of crisis was something rare and precious. By the following spring, with the blessing of her parents, who traveled from Missouri for the occasion, and the enthusiastic support of the entire town of Red Bluff, Margaret became Mrs. Garrett Tucker in a simple ceremony in the town's small church. Clara Holden wept openly during the exchange of vows, while James pretended the dust in the air was affecting his eyes. Douglas Warner served as best man, having become a close friend to both Garrett and Margaret during his frequent visits to Red Bluff on legal business. "You look beautiful," Garrett whispered as they shared their first dance as husband and wife at the celebration afterward. Margaret smiled up at him, her heart full to bursting. "I feel beautiful and happy, so very happy." "No regrets?" he asked, suddenly serious. "About Thomas, about the ranch?" "None," Margaret said firmly. Thomas would have wanted this for us. The ranch was his dream that became our dream. Now it's our dream, yours and mine. They had decided to keep the property, renaming it Tucker's Glen in honor of both its past and its future. Under their joint management, it had already begun to thrive, with expanded herds and new croplands. "I never thought I'd find a home again," Garrett confessed, holding her close as they swayed to the music. "After the war, after losing my family, I convinced myself that drifting was easier than risking loss again." "And now," Margaret prompted, "now I can't imagine being anywhere but here with you." He brushed a kiss against her forehead. "You gave me a reason to stop running, Margaret. A reason to build something lasting." Later that night, as they stood on the porch of their home, truly their home now, watching the stars emerge in the velvet sky, Margaret reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. Vernon's cruel presumption that she was property to be claimed had led, ultimately, to her finding a man who saw her as nothing less than an equal partner, a beloved companion, a cherished wife. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Tucker?" Garrett asked, his arms encircling her from behind as they gazed at the night sky. "About how sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead us to the best," she replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "If Vernon hadn't tried to claim me as his property, we might never have met." Garrett chuckled, the sound vibrating pleasantly against her back. "I'd like to think we would have found each other somehow. Some things are just meant to be." Margaret turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face tenderly. "I believe you're right, Garrett Tucker. I believe you're right." As his lips found hers in a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she was no one's property, but she was most definitely, most happily, someone's beloved. 2 years later, on a warm spring morning, Margaret sat on the porch of Tucker's Glen, watching Garrett work with a young colt in the corral. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, feeling the strong kicks of the child who would join their family in just a few weeks. "Your papa is good with horses," she murmured to her unborn child. "He's good with everything, really. You're a lucky little one to be born into so much love." The ranch had prospered beyond their expectations. With Garrett's knowledge of livestock and Margaret's head for business, they had expanded their operations to include not just cattle, but also breeding and training quality horses, which were in high demand throughout California. Vernon remained in prison, his occasional letters of apology receiving polite but distant responses from Margaret. She had forgiven him not for his sake, but for her own, but she would never forget the lessons his actions had taught her about self-reliance and the true meaning of partnership. Clara and James Holden were frequent visitors, already declaring themselves honorary grandparents to the coming child. Douglas Warner had opened a law office in Red Bluff, drawn by the town's growth, and perhaps also by the pretty schoolteacher who had recently arrived from San Francisco. Life wasn't perfect. There were still difficult days, disagreements, challenges to overcome. But Margaret faced each one with the knowledge that she was neither alone nor diminished by her partnership with Garrett. If anything, their union had made her stronger, more confident, more fully herself. In the corral, Garrett looked up, catching her watching him. His face broke into a smile that still, after 2 years of marriage, made her heart skip a beat. He said something to the ranch hand working with him, then vaulted over the fence and strode toward the house. "How are my 2 favorite people this morning?" he asked, settling beside her on the porch swing. "We're fine," Margaret replied, placing his hand on her belly so he could feel the baby's movements. "Active. Your son or daughter seems eager to join us." Garrett's expression softened with wonder as he felt the kicks beneath his palm. "I still can't believe it sometimes," he admitted. "That we found each other, that we're building this life together, that we're going to be parents." Margaret leaned against him, content in a way she had once thought impossible after Thomas's death. "I can believe it. Some things are just meant to be, remember," Garrett laughed, kissing the top of her head. "Using my own words against me, Mrs. Tucker, always," she promised with a smile. As they sat together on the porch of the home, they had built not just the physical structure, but the life, the partnership, the family they were creating. Margaret reflected on how far she had come from those dark days when Vernon had claimed her as his property. From object to owner, from possession to partner, from survivor to thriver, her journey had not been easy, but the destination had been worth every difficult step along the way. "I love you, Garrett Tucker," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of all they had experienced together. "And I love you, Margaret Tucker," he replied, his blue eyes reflecting the depth of his feeling. "From the first moment I saw you, and for all the moments yet to come." As their lips met in a tender kiss, Margaret knew that this love, this partnership, this shared life was everything she had ever wanted. Not to be owned, but to be cherished. Not to be claimed, but to be chosen. Not to be possessed, but to be loved, truly and completely, for exactly who she was. And that, she thought as Garrett's hand caressed her cheek, was worth more than all the ranches in California combined.